Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Active Inference Lab, to the Active Inference Livestream. Today it is Active Inference Livestream 15.1, and it is February 2nd, 2021. Welcome to the Active Inference Lab, everyone. We are an experiment in online team communication, learning, and practice related to active inference. You can find us on our website, Twitter, Discord, Gmail, YouTube, or Keybase Public Team. This is a recorded and an archived live stream, so please provide us with feedback so that we can improve on our work. All backgrounds and perspectives are welcome here. And as far as video etiquette for live streams, we'll mute if there's noise in our background and raise our hands so we can hear from everybody. Today, we are in 15.1 on February 2nd, and really excited and thankful to have both authors of this paper today and also joining us for next week. So that's going to be really exciting. Check out this spreadsheet if you want to see the most updated event calendar for Active Inference Livestream. But here we are in 15 with a rapid introduction. Today we're going to have an introduction to each other, especially some of us who are new on the stream. And then we're going to be kind of walking through the paper, having ideas, having fun conversations, and also writing down ideas that we want to discuss more in 15.2, which will be like a follow-up discussion on this. So if you're participating live or watching later, then just write down ideas and questions you're having and get in touch with us if you want to participate. So here we are in the introductions. Today we'll go around, introduce ourselves, and then just we're in it. So we'll have a fun conversation. I'm Daniel Friedman. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in California. And yeah, I'm just really excited to be having this conversation. So I will pass it first to our authors, Ines and Thomas. Oh, we can't hear you, Ines, but you're not muted. So reload and let's go to Thomas. Thomas, can you unmute and introduce yourself? And then Ines just like Control R reload. And then it will probably work with the audio. But go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Thomas van S. I'm currently a PhD student in Antwerp at the University of Antwerp. I'm working primarily on enactivism and the free energy principle. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We're going to look forward to hearing a lot more from you. And Ines, can we hear you now?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Great. All right. So my name is Ines. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain. And yeah, and my topic of research is on dynamical systems and e-cognition in general.
Great. Then we can just pass it to whoever hasn't spoken. So go to Shannon.
Hey, I'm Shannon. I'm a PhD student at the University of California in Merced, and I work on sensory-motor neuroscience and the dynamics of crowd behavior. I'll pass it to Sasha.
Sasha disappeared. Let's go to Stephen Slett, then Scott David.
Oh, hello, I'm Stephen. I'm in Toronto. I work a lot with participatory theatre and community development. I'm doing a practice-based PhD at the moment through Canterbury Christ Church University. And I will pass it over to Alex.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I'm in Moscow, Russia, and I'm a researcher in Systems Management School and still trying to find the ways to join active inference and systems thinking frameworks. And I pass it to Sasha.
Hi, I'm Sasha. I'll try this again. I'm a graduate student in neuroscience and studying early brain development and based in California. And I will pass it to Blue.
Good morning. I am Blue Knight. I am an independent research consultant based out of New Mexico. I don't know who hasn't gotten it. Maybe I'll pass it to Marco.
Hi, I'm Marco Lin. I'm based in Holland. Basically just a free energy active inference enthusiast. Happy to be here. I'll pass it to Scott.
Hi, folks. My name is Scott David. I'm the director of the Information Risk Research Initiative at the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab. My background is a lawyer, and what we're doing is engineering systems that are socio-technical systems. So it's parameterization for technical and social elements of active inference-based systems. Thanks.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone so much for coming on live. This is really going to be a great discussion and also a really prescient paper. So great to hear everyone's views on it. In these warm-up questions, we can just begin wherever people have been heading into today's discussion from. So I'll just list them and then people can raise their hand and we'll hear from everybody who wants to speak. What is something you're excited about today? What is something that you liked or remembered about the paper? What motivated you to come to this discussion, to read the paper, think through these topics? And then also, what's something that you're wondering about or would like to have resolved by the end of today's or next week's discussion? So until anyone raises their hand, Ines and or Thomas, I just wanted to ask, how do you start by communicating this research, or what led you to this question? I'm going to kick out the ghost, Ines's. But, yeah.
So should I take this, Ines, or you want to?
Wait, you're muted right now.
Sorry. Yeah, no, Thomas, just go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the way I got to the idea of the paper is that I'm primarily coming at it from a radical inactivist perspective, where there's a lot of antagonism towards representations, models, and whatnot. In the meantime, I got very excited about the free energy principle, and I've been sort of trying to sort out where that all fits, what the models mean, what everything means in everything that's being said. And so Ines and I were talking about it, and we started talking about representations and models in the free energy principle, and we figured out that it really depends on how you interpret the models and what exactly you take the mathematics to mean. And based on that, we just started listing out the different options you could have and what they mean and what we personally thought about those, what we thought were good aspects, less nice aspects. And through all of that, we sort of came up with instrumentalism as the only path forward.
Awesome. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of great second thoughts and conversations on that. So anyone can raise their hand, but either Ines or Thomas, just to lead into those who might not be familiar with long-running debates in the philosophy of science or multiple possible ways to interpret formalisms. How do you convey this instrumentalism, realism question and motivate its importance?
Shall I take it, Thomas?
Sure.
Okay. So one thing that we thought was like really interesting to think about is that the majority of the accounts within the free energy principle or process theories, they are very much realist. So that's what Thomas and I started questioning, and we think that it's interesting because there's been other people also joining that particular concerns that we also have. So we thought that this would be something that we needed to look at, and the question, just to sort of like give a little bit of context on where we are in the literature, is that the majority of the approaches were on the realist camp, even those that were coming from inactivism. And that's where we found things to be a little bit strange, because the first question is whether one is licensed to take a realist account from the fact that we can model the brain, or we can model the neuronal activity, or we can model cognitive activity. So that's the one question that we wanted to think about and look at, whether we are licensed to take a realist stand, and if we are, what is the argument, what is the evidence to think that this machinery that we use in our scientific modeling can also be exist somewhere in neuronal activity or cognitive activity. So that was one thing. Then the other thing was that there started to be like a sort of like a wave that was taking the free energy to be compatible with an activism. And it might, we started thinking about and questioning this, because it might be the case that they may not be compatible after all, because as we know, on the side of the inactivism, there's like a claim against representations, for example. But then on the predictive accounts of cognition on the other side, you sort of need representations to get your theory going, because you need to have predictions, you need to have prediction errors coming, so you need to rely on representational machinery. So that's what we thought, that it's important for us to question and think about whether it is actually the case that these two things can be made compatible. So on the one side, the predictive accounts of cognition, which take representations in a very literal account, and on the other side, the inactivism, which for the majority of the people on the inactivism side, cognition doesn't come down, or is not all the way through representational. So this is sort of like where we are navigating the literature here. It's sort of like between the very representational predictive accounts of cognition and the realism that's a stand that they kind of need to take, and on the other side, the inactivism, which there's sort of like a tendency recently to be made like sort of compatible under the same roof, so to speak.
Great. Thank you both for contextualizing, and everybody can raise their hands so that we can make sure to hear from everybody's excitement here. But yes, the bigger question is, does making a model have a realist interpretation? If you make a model of the brain as a steam engine, is it really a steam engine? No. But then if you make a model of it as a free energy principle corollary process theory, is it really that? That's kind of the discussion. And there's a lot on the line, which we're going to tease out. So Shannon, and then anyone else who raises their hand.
Yeah, so sort of jumping to the end of the paper already. You say like the model in scientific practice is a representation of the nervous system to the extent that it holds explanatory capacity. And I think like a lot of neuroscientists that I talk to, if you start bringing up, you know, the representation wars, the representation debate, that's like, that's something that philosophers worry about. But we know when we say representation, we just kind of need a word to stand in for our conversation so we can talk about like patterned activity of neurons, and we don't care that it could stand separate or not from the situation or the environment, but it's useful. It's a useful word to use so that way we can have language and talk about the system or the pattern of activity that we're interested in that's associated with some behavior. And I just think that sounds right, like how you conclude it. And maybe I didn't have a question. Maybe this was a moment where I had to comment more of a question. So apologies, but if that sparks some conversation, that would be great.
It's something that stayed with you and will change how you think about even other kinds of models. Next time you see a linear regression, maybe you're going to wonder if it's being used in a realist or an instrumentalist context. So thanks for sharing it, Shannon. Stephen, and then anyone else.
One thing I think is quite interesting is that, just like Shannon was saying about, you know, often a word gets used, but then it's kind of fuzzy, and then it kind of gets like hand waved away around why it's maybe not that clear. I think this also maybe the same challenge comes up with pragmatism, because pragmatism is really useful and it gets used in a lot of context. But now, because everything's slightly pragmatic in the sense that it's all about action through the free energy principle, it becomes so, calling it instrumentalism sort of helps in a way get a bit of clarity when it's something which is about theory. So I wonder, I'd be interested to know about how the pragmatism wasn't used as the word and used a more sort of clear unpacking, I suppose.
Yeah, great question. So anybody, authors or otherwise, what is the relationship between pragmatism and utility and then instrumentalism? So we're using the instruments ostensibly for pragmatic ends, but the authors chose to frame the discussion in terms of realism versus instrumentalism instead of pragmatism versus, say, anti-pragmatism, or some other, it could be pragmatism versus realism, perhaps. So any authors or other hands?
I don't mind saying just a few words, and then perhaps I'll hand it over to Thomas. But I just wanted to, the one way that I think that it's useful for me to think this is the use of representations. So in what sense are we using representations? Because Shannon was saying, she was raising a very good point. It is very useful to refer to these things, that this activity that's going on in the brain as representations. But I think that in what sense are we using representations is important, because if it's in a sort of a metaphor, then obviously there is no problem, because it is actually very useful. And we are building all of these, we are trying to make sense of all of these data that we gather from the brain. And that's in some sense building a representation, because what is a representation? Representation is a sentence, is a picture, is a map. These are kinds of representations. Why is this problematic? It's because these are things that we as human beings do. We do that in our daily lives, and we do that in our labs. So we build these representations to make sense of the observations that we do in our labs and in our daily lives. So then we can obviously use this word, this concept, but it doesn't have the same meaning, or it does in the realist sense. So I think it comes down to how serious are we in the use of these words? Are we using this in a literal sense, in the sense of like sentences, maps, pictures that we as human beings have and build and develop, and the brain also has them? Or are we using it in a metaphorical way? Which is, if it's in a metaphorical way because it's useful to use the concept, then it should be fine. It's a metaphor. Okay, and that's it.
Really interesting. A metaphor is really an instrument. When somebody says that this movie was like, it's like an ocean of ideas, or it was like an ocean, a simile, they're using that sentence representation instrumentally to convey a point, to, communicate something that is internal to the thinker. And then that is not meant to be interpreted realistically. But in science, where there's a strong realist kick amongst some people, they think it isn't science unless it's not going to be the realist, most mechanistic thing. Now, whether it's mechanism all the way down, or what the lowest level mechanism is, that's sort of where those realist ideas bottom out. But without going that way, it is across fields and across different media. We ask whether we're meaning something really or instrumentally. So any other thoughts? What was some, Scott, people can raise their hand on Jitsi because I'm not always looking at the actual video screen. So thanks, Scott, and then anyone else.
I was just wondering, it's interesting in terms of the encoding and the decoding notion. So if you have different isms on either side of your encoding and decoding, that seems like where you have the problem potentially. So if someone's encoding a communication as a metaphor, but it's taken not as a metaphor, but as something stronger, and it's decoded that way, then there's a miscommunication. One of the things that I've been trying to fuss with, and it feels like this is that place, the painter Kandinsky said that violent societies yield abstract art. And I always wondered whether that's reversible, whether abstraction is a form of violence. And here, that feels like that might be relevant, because if I abstract something with one ism, and then it's in my encoding of my message, and then it's decoded by someone else who's decoding it with a different ism, then that abstraction has led to a violence. In fact, it might lead to actual harm to that other person, because they may misinterpret my message based on that schism of isms you have there. I had to go there. But anyways, is that something that challenge of communication across boundaries feels like it's invoked here, and what might be some strategies for doing something about that?
Thanks, Scott, for the great question, Thomas. And then we just continue down the stack. So people can just throw up their hand raised whenever they have a thought, and we'll get to everybody.
Yeah, I think these three comments really together cut at the heart of the matter. I think that indeed, from what I have heard myself, neuroscientists pretty much often know what they mean with representation, and they don't take it to mean anything much more robust than a sort of correlation between particular patterns of activity and particular things that we see happening. And it's more robust than that, but not anyway what the philosophers take it to mean. But the issue is then exactly in communication, where it feels like among neuroscientists it's a bit of an insider's knowledge that representation is sort of a metaphor. It's like the computer metaphor as a whole. It's a metaphor, and you shouldn't take it in a realist way, as we would say. But when students read a handbook, this is not always that obvious. And I've also talked to neuroscientists that really believed that the rats had a literal map in their brain, like we have a sort of JPEG on our computer, because they were talking about representational maps in the brain. And if you know a little bit about philosophy in this area, philosophers take these neuroscientists talk about representations to mean just about anything that they like. So I think that the issue is indeed one, if you want to talk about that way, of encoding and decoding, that they encode a metaphor, and some people that are in the know decode a metaphor, but many people don't. And I've noticed that exactly with the free energy principle, where it feels like it gets very muddy with what is metaphor and what isn't, and what people take to be metaphor and what isn't. In that sense, my main project here is to try and create clarity in what it could possibly mean. And even if people completely disagree with the position, I think at the very least, I would like just people to be more clear about what they really mean.
Thanks, Thomas, and really one of the goals of these discussions that we're having. So we're going to go to Shannon, Stephen, Ines.
Yeah, this is actually really great, Thomas and Scott. I hadn't thought about it this way before. So no one in the general public cares about the representation wars. That might not be true, but like nobody cares. But whenever science from a neuroscientist gets picked up by a journalist who then makes the article with the headline that says, your brain has models inside of it that it's running, and you should learn music because it will make you smarter, but learning coding won't make you smarter, which was like a headline recently. But that translation process that Scott was talking about, that encoding and decoding, really gets stuck, and it doesn't get decoded when it gets written about in sort of like more mainstream news outlets. Like maybe someone's Medium blog post that they're writing, and they're a really dedicated grad student who's grappling with these ideas all the time, and they're very clear in their writing about what scientists mean when they're talking about a representation or a model, what this means for the actual brain itself, and then what this means for you as a person just reading about it. But that doesn't always come across in like the headline on CNN or or like the Facebook feed that's scrolling through, you know, my adult parents' computer screen. And so being clear, you have to go through this step of using it as a useful metaphor in neuroscience, getting clear what the metaphors could be, if they're real or just instrumental readings in the philosophy camp. And then like the one more step is bringing the science communicators in and getting them to parse this huge debate down into something that's able to be distributed to folks who aren't enmeshed in this every day.
Thanks, Shannon. So Stephen, Ines, Sasha.
And well, this clash is definitely a useful discussion, because I think inactivism, radical inactivism, and free energy are both trying to come in and say it's not all in the head. So just like you're saying, this, the challenge you've got is as soon as people talk about neuroscience and that, it's like there's just an assumption in our culture that it's all in the head. It's not even, so that metaphor is like it's a signpost, and then everything else becomes. And is it a film playing in my head? And it's like, well, wait a sec, it's the mind-body environment with a dynamic system. And it's about action. And they look at you with this like, wait. So it's like it slips into that. So I think this is a really good point, because like metaphors, when you embody them, are kind of like you inactively understand what it's like to be inside them. But then when they just become like a signpost for what to do, they lose all of that kind of architecture. So I think this is quite valuable.
Yep, the metaphors and the language, Stephen, and related to the science communication point, it's oh well, this is hardwired in, or the DNA codes for this protein. It uses the language that's implicit in a very specific understanding, and that metaphor gets over interpreted, and then you start, well, where's the RAM in the brain? You know, where's the GPU? And then you start building out this metaphor. Before you know it, you're way down the rabbit hole with something that was basically, in terms of this paper, taking a realist reading on an instrumentalist project. And again, we just think about other kinds of modeling. If you did a steam engine model of the brain, it's not a steam engine. If you do a linear regression, it's not a linear regression. So if you do an active inference model, it's not an active inference brain. But that is very nuanced to communicate because of the way that our language is. So Ines and Sasha, then anyone else.
Yeah, I think these are very good remarks. I just wanted to, I think I have to disagree just a tiny bit, just to make a point about, I think that there are real issues and there are real dangers in conceiving of, in the ways that we conceive things, and especially in the ways that we use our language and our concepts, and particularly we're looking at the concept of representation, but there are others that I can think of. I can think of the concept of hierarchy, for example. That could be a metaphor, could be used in a realist way. There's new papers on this, which are very relevant and very interesting. But what I want to say is that in the particular case of the representation, I think there are real dangers in using, it's not just how the science is communicated, or, oh, maybe this is not a problem for me to deal with, let's just the philosophers handle that. That's not real for my particular lab. It's not going to be an issue. I think it's going to be an issue. Because I think the way that you conceptualize, however the processes are going on in the brain, is going to dictate the way that you design and you interpret the results. So I'm thinking, for example, there's a bit in the paper where we make a distinction between two kinds of modeling techniques that we can use. And they have two very different goals, ambitions, worries, and they end up in very different conclusions. And so one of them takes as for free that there is information in the brain. So this kind of modeling is the kind of modeling that uses structural causal models, and what they aim for is to think about the relations between the nodes. These are nodes that are highly connected, and the way that we design and understand or interpret the data coming from those models is by the presence or absence of information. Now, this means that we are taking information for free, information for existing in the brain. So what kind of information are we talking about? Is it the kind of information that I also have in my model? Because if it is, then we're talking about semantic information. And I mean, it may be the case that the brain actually works with the very same kind of information that I have in my model, but we need to prove that. That's an assumption.
Thanks.
And this is how we are building our models, and I think that's one worry. Now, the other worry is that in building these models, that's the inactivist worry, which Stephen was just mentioning, which is if we say that, well, the cognition comes down to these representations happening in the brain, then so much for the rest of cognition that is in the body, and the body being in the environment. So that all these inactivist sort of like tradition. And I just wanted to add that.
Cool. Thank you. We have Sasha, Shannon, Alex.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that so well, and bringing this to the forefront, that this is an issue to be grappled with. I think from the neuroscience background, yes, it is just relegated to philosophers to deal with these bigger questions, but leading to this, going back to this idea of encoding and decoding, it really does matter what is meant by the phrase and then how it's decoded. And I think in the world of like molecular neuroscience and just recording signals from the brain, we really think that we're measuring something real about the system. Whether or not that's what's actually happening, that's just one measurement of the overall behavior. And to just lean into instrumentalism, it's a useful metaphor for what we're seeing. But obviously, people don't have the training or the decoding of the philosophy perspective on what that means. And so I've never thought about it until this paper, that this could be a real issue even in my own work. So I think it's really important to get into the nuance of what we mean when we use these metaphors.
Thanks, Sasha, Shannon, Alex. Well, okay, yeah, go ahead, Shannon.
Yeah, so that's really great. I didn't mean to say that like only science communicators and philosophers should worry about this question. But I think so, like something that this reminded me of in sort of my field. So I look at music perception in the brain, and I kind of have a question of, does the brain use internal models to predict timing mechanisms? And this metaphor that you brought up, that how it affects the assumptions that you make and how you design or analyze or interpret your experiment. I think it also makes a case for pluralism. Like, if you're realist, then pluralist about realist approaches. If you're making metaphors, then pluralist about the type of metaphor that could be useful. So we thought, or a lot of neuroscientists still think, there's a clock mechanism in the brain or a pacemaker that's just like tracking rhythmic activity. But maybe there's this move now that there's more of a Bayesian mechanism that's building up a timing model that's now predicting when or what the next event will be that occurs. And one of those might be more explanatorily useful, and the other one will fall away. But I don't know if we can actually ever prove that there is a Bayesian mechanism in the brain or that there is a clock model in the brain. I think as far as we can get is that taking this approach is more explanatorily useful than taking the other approach.
Cool. And it made me think, from my background as an evolutionary biologist, about the question, what is a gene? And that's a philosophical question that they don't really discuss too much in genetics departments. But of course, the way that you consider what a gene is, it's going to set up what you measure, who's included on the research project, how you write about it, how you analyze it. I mean, it's the primary determinant. So whether what's happening with the electrical signals in the brain is part of a real model that is being built out, or whether that is something like we're just measuring the temperature, but then we're modeling something totally separate. And then also just quickly, the pluralism. It's easier to be pluralistic with metaphors, because it's like we can always write new poems. We can always have new metaphors. We can always build and do yes and with the metaphors. But realism, it's a little harder to be pluralist because ostensibly it's not multiple things at once, or potentially, we can't all be living our own truth for what the brain is. But we can, of course, can have our own perspectives. So actually it totally opens the door to pluralism in a really qualified way, where we can come together and talk about what's useful rather than debate about who's right about how things are. So really nice framing. So Alex and then Ines.
Thanks. For me, as I came from engineering world to learning active inference, instrumentalism approach was an only way starting to understand what what is happening, because when I start to finding and look at models in this framework, it was a way for my mind to get basics and trying to go deeper. But as for this paper, for me it's great because it gives great promotion for instrumentalism approach. And I just think if there is a notion for radical instrumentalism, if so, can we use it, and how it should be described? And again, for me, honestly, I don't care much about philosophy debates or even neuroscience debates. I'm watching on a world around in terms of systems and trying to understand these systems basically as black boxes, understand their behavior without understanding how these deep rabbit holes inside working. So that's why it's interesting for me is for reading this paper and these discussions too. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. So Ines and then Thomas.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what you were just mentioning, Daniel, about the pluralist approach. I think that, yeah, you said that something that sounded very, very right to me, which is one can only take this pluralist, or it's at least easier to take the pluralist route if we are on the sort of the instrumentalist side. So, for example, with the example that we have in the paper, with these two kinds of different modeling approaches that we can take, like dynamical causal modeling or structural causal modeling. If we take an instrumentalist approach, then we can say that these two different sorts of modeling techniques, they can work together, where, for example, what you get from the structural causal modeling, which is you get like a sort of a nice topological description of the connections arranged in the brain, so get a nice map of that, which can sort of combined with dynamical causal modeling, where you get, for example, the dynamics in terms of states and how the activity occurs. You can combine this in a pluralist way, as long as you take this much more instrumentalist approach, and you don't take it to be the case that what you're getting from these models is what is actually the case. So I just wanted to add that.
Yes, like we have one instrument that helps us find the structure and the topology, the connectness. We have another instrument that measures or helps us do inference on a slightly different attribute. And it's not a philosophical debate whether it's actually just dynamics or actually just topology. It's actually us investigating a system we care about. And then that's what can bring people to the table. So Thomas, and then Scott David, then anyone else.
Yeah, I think that's really quite right. I've spoken about this paper with other people as well, and some were worried that instrumentalism was placing too strong of a limit on our scientific endeavors. That if we say, oh, well, we can only ever be instrumentalist, then they said, why do science at all? If we can't really get at the heart of the matter, if we can't actually at some sort of finish line say, okay, well, now we have just an accurate description of what cognition is and how organisms navigate the environment. And I think that's a fair worry. I wonder if perhaps it's just a bit too ambitious, but who knows what we can do in 100 years. And I do think in that perspective, it is important to see that the paper doesn't really get into that grander philosophy of science debate about model instrumentalism across the board, right? So it could very well be that at some point we'll get a model that really well describes everything that really happens in an organism. Maybe. The main point here, as I take it anyway, Ines might disagree, of course, is that at the very least, in the free energy principle, you don't get that entailment of, because we can model it, the organism models as well. But it's not, it could be that in the end we can take a realist position on some other model in the future.
Nice. So we're not committed to yet this instrumentalist across the board. We can be realist elsewhere and we can be realist in the future, but you've laid out a research agenda and a logical structure for asking whether, have we met some of these claims that were brought up in your paper on another topic or for free energy in the future.
On that note, to quickly get back to what Alex was saying, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to commit to radical instrumentalism. We don't have to be that radical.
Although that might be called engineering by some, so maybe it already exists. So Scott and then Ines.
Yeah, and along those lines, so I mentioned before that I was an attorney. So rhetoric is persuasive speech, and it is what we attorneys produce. And so it's interesting when you talk about instrumentalism and realism in terms of rhetoric. So I used to say to my kids all the time that the only time you see reality is when you see paradox, and any other time you're living inside a model. And so that means that when people talk about resolving paradox, what they're talking about is whose model wins. But I always told my kids you should manage paradox, not try to resolve it, because that is reality. So let me take that. What I'm suggesting is metaphor may be reality in certain contexts, because the management of the paradox happens through rhetorical speech. The incommensurables are brought together with the rhetoric. You create a story to make it a thing, right? And so what I'm wondering is, I was thinking of the analogy of the well-tempered clavier when Bach was tempering musical notes, right? There's all sorts of notes out there, and then the scale was decided upon. And now it's a scale, and it's objective, and it's mathematically demonstrable why it's a good scale, but it's not the only scale. And so that kind of idea of managing paradox through, I guess it's instrumentalism, because you're allowing for multiple approaches. What I'm wondering is there a preference for one or the other in trying to motivate change in groups? And then the second part of that, so that's one, and then the other part is I beginning to understand that I believe that the mind doesn't exist in the brain, it exists in language. And the brain is an antenna that's tuned into that. So from that perspective, can anything be other than instrumentalist?
So you made a claim about what the brain is. So that was a realist claim about it. But yes, great questions, Scott. So we got Ines, Blue.
Okay, I just wanted to add something to what Thomas was saying, actually, whether we lose something when we take the instrumentalist part. And I think that my concern is that I'm not sure if we can even have the realist part. And I'm not sure if that's an option. So the reason being, and I'm going to come back to the examples that we have in the paper, because I think these are like practical, useful examples, or concrete examples that we can think about amongst ourselves, even if we come from very different backgrounds. But there are some scientists here, some neuroscientists here, and I think that's useful to come back to what we're really talking about with examples. So with the two different kinds of modeling, or let's say just two major ones that we refer to in the paper, where you have one kind of modeling that is trying to capture a topological description of how things are, and then you have this other kind of modeling where you're trying to explain why things behave in the way that they do, right? And that's sort of like the more dynamical systems one. So in a sense, in the dynamical systems one, it's explanatory because you're trying to explain why things behave in the way that they do. And the crucial point here that we also point out in the paper is that when you explain to answer the question why, you need to have a theory, you need to have a hypothesis. So this means that these models in dynamical causal modeling, they are hypothesis dependent, right? So you are looking for an explanation as opposed to a description for example, structural causal modeling, attracting functional connectivity, for example. So what I want to say is that in these two particular ways of modeling things, you already find two different goals and two different strategies. One is descriptive, the other one is explanatory. Now, my question is whether modeling this in this way will lose any explanatory traction. I don't think we do. I think that this depends on what we are doing and how we are doing, because if our research is going to be driven by a hypothesis, then you're going to get this explanatory traction. And let me just give you a very quick example. So let's say that you are modeling a pendulum. Right, you're modeling a pendulum and you're trying to explain. So there are two things you can do with this. You can describe the pendulum, and you can also try to come up with an explanation for why the pendulum behaves the way that it does. Right, once you do, the explanations, obviously it's very obvious for us because it's a very simple system. The explanation is going to be on, well, that's the laws of physics, obviously, right? But what you've just done is you've just explained what a pendulum is doing, why the pendulum is behaving like that by using these two different ways of modeling the pendulum, why it behaves in the way that it do and how it behaves in the way that it do. You have your why by using the laws of physics, and you cannot at any point say that the pendulum is representing the model. And yet you explain why the pendulum is behaving the way that it is. So I just want to say that I'm not so sure that we should take the realist, or that we need to take the realist part, just on the account that perhaps you lose explanatory traction. Well, we are explaining the natural world by modeling the natural world. So I just wanted to add that.
I'm going to retrace that gem of an argument, actually. Realism is looking for descriptions, explanations about how things really are. Instrumentalism is testing hypotheses. And then the key twist in the discussion, in the argument, is our hypotheses are about explanations of the system. So we actually get the benefits really without the baggage of realism, because we're hypothesis-driven investigators as scientists searching for explanations through hypotheses. So by centering the hypothesis quest, we can be instrumentalists and get the realist fruit. But if we act like we're realists, like we're searching for an explanation or a description of a system, we get lost, we're not hypothesis-driven, and we're trapped with all this baggage of realism. So very clear, and really thanks for sharing it. We got Blue, Thomas, Stephen.
So I hate to jump off of that wonderful explanation by Ines, regarding realism, but I have to go back to what Scott David just said about the mind and the brain, because it's something that I think about a lot, and that I am pretty deeply involved in. But language cannot be where the mind exists. And I'm not going to say that I think that the mind exists in the brain, because I don't, but I think that the mind also cannot exist in language, because that just, it totally, negates the experience of someone like Helen Keller, who didn't acquire language until she was, well into her late childhood. So before that, did she have no mind? I don't think that that's fair. But also, in any kind of trauma experience, people don't have language for the trauma. So were you mindless at that time, or do you have no mind to conceptualize the trauma? So there are many experiences that happen on a very primal and very emotional level that cannot be explained or represented with language, right? So I think that the mind can't exist there. And then maybe to tie this back into the realist versus instrumentalist, like, is language real, right? Like, so I mean, I'm one of these people that really questions reality and what is real, like what can we take to be a realistic representation. And so language to me is an instrument. So I mean, it's something that, like, it's not even, it's a human concept, so it doesn't exist outside of our perspective, reality, which, I mean, to me, like, it totally pushes the realist debate off the table, because, like, what even is real? And I have a neuroscience background, but I know, like, even in neuroscience, there are very wide schisms, like people that think that reality is a concrete, objective thing. But I'm like, reality exists here, and, like, that's it, right? So I'm on that other side of the wall. Anyway, that's it. So sorry, no questions, just some thoughts.
Thank you. Thomas, Stephen, and then anyone else. And then Mark.
Yeah, thanks. I think my initial point was just to react to Ines, her beautiful explanation there. And I really think that should have been in the paper, because it's actually a really, really good way to set it up. Yeah, that's really good. As for the where the mind is and what's real, I think I'd love to chat on about that for probably hours. I think it's very interesting. And I think the inactivist perspective is a very nice middle passage between, there's an objective reality that we are approaching, or it's all in the mind. However, I think really getting into that will probably take us a little bit too far away from active inference, so I'll leave it at that. But yeah,
the conversations, we're on the freeway, all these fun keywords and side discussions, the off ramp. So thanks for sharing it, Stephen. Then Marco.
Yeah, I mean, the culture does come back to how we frame looking at reality. So we tend to look at reality either with a perspective and model it, or to get that perspective, we use these tools, because we're a very kind of like tool-based kind of culture now. But I like in the paper, it says in that first abstract, it remains disputed whether its statistical models are scientific tools, but then it says to describe non-equilibrium steady state systems. So in a way, non-equilibrium steady state systems as kind of like a foundational ground that could be to some extent real. It's the question of the models that are used to describe how they work that isn't real, so I think that's also, like, this doesn't, like, there's still room for the idea that the brain at some level, even though it's quite abstract, is a non-equilibrium steady state system. It's just that the models, the statistical models, shouldn't also be the way that system's doing its job, so to speak. So I think that's kind of, and I suppose what that also then brings back is, how do we get at that? And this is where I'm quite interested in indigenous ways of knowing, because, well, if you don't come from a perspectival route, and if what if you come from other, like, metaphors is one level, but other sort of swarming kind of non-literal ways of knowing, non-verbal, maybe that's another avenue that opens up, that says, okay, maybe we have to come at it through other ways of modeling. Anyway.
Thanks, Stephen. Marco, then anyone else.
Hi, thanks. So first of all, just fair disclosure, I haven't fully read it yet, but it's an interesting discussion, and Scott mentioned paradox, and I'll take that up. I actually suspect that the paradoxical interpretation might actually be the correct interpretation. So we have the nice table of possible interpretations for the FEP, a 2x2 table, but what if it's all of them, right? So the FEP, especially in the elaborations and active inference, is already kind of paradox, because you already have these trade-offs between accuracy, complexity, or the epistemic and the pragmatic aspects. So in kind of a weird way, the whole discussion, kind of flip-flopping around the different interpretations, seems to me to parallel the way that the, let's say, first deflationary, the statistical densities in the brain actually fulfill different roles depending on their actual relation with the world, right? When I'm actually just imagining about the world, then the representational relation between the densities and the targets are not actually with respect to the world. They're actually with respect to each other in my brain, right? But nevertheless, we're still situated in the real world, at the very least, if we assume an objective reality as in a reality that is not dependent upon our interpretation until we act upon it. Then at least we can say that by virtue of FEP, at least what it suggests, that the way that these models, the way that these statistical structures and densities are shaped by something that is real. So in that sense, I personally, sorry, I have a lot of allergies for some stuff in philosophy, but I'm very much against this whole notion that the representational content or representations have to be adjudicated by some accuracy or correctness condition. And I think it's exactly FEP that challenges that, right? Why the hell would that be reasonable, that a representation has to be correct? Rather, it is that it is shaped by some sort of correctness, right? But if it would be stuck in that, we would never get somewhere, right? As an organism, it's not about being true or right or correct all the time. It's about being able to ratchet yourself in virtue of this adaptive imperative. I'm not sure where I'm going. I still have to properly absorb everything. But maybe not to tie this up, is what would you think of instead of choosing one of the table's cells, one of these possibilities, more embracing what is, in my opinion, part of the FEP and saying that it's actually the paradox of it's all of them and none of them.
Thanks, Marco. And I also agree the FEP helps us by thinking about how the observations get to us. Whatever side of the blanket or the interface we're on, we can take those observations with deathly seriousness, instrumentally. It's not that the actual movement of the water molecules is going to kill you, but there are temperatures that kill you. And so we can take our measurements seriously and be instrumentalist from our side of the blanket and say, yeah, there might be a real system. Let's hypothesize as instrumentalists about what is out there. But if we're waiting on our side of the blanket until we have resolved what is quite literally on the other side of the blanket, then it's going to be arguing about what's inside of a box that can't be opened. And then policy failure is going to be the outcome. So it's a really interesting point about how we're kind of using this FEP scaffold to actually navigate this paradox. So really cool there. So Ines, Scott, Thomas.
Okay, I just wanted to add to what Marco was saying. I think it was a wonderful remark. And I just wanted to, because that also allows me to sort of like draw or highlight a point that we made in the paper that was also very fundamental. And this is just that the FEP in itself does not have to entail this table. We can talk about the FEP without talking about this table. And that's a point that we try to make in the paper. So this table only comes up as something that is relevant to us once we start talking about process theories or the corollary, active inference. Because the FEP in itself comes from variational free energy, which is a measure of the variational free energy to attain model evidence in variational base. So we don't have to talk about this table to talk about the FEP, okay? And we don't even have to talk about active inference or process theories. That's when we start talking about, okay, how is it that the system is minimizing free energy? That's when we come up with these process theories to try to explain how is it that the system minimizes this free energy, right? And that's when we start bumping into these conceptualizations that our explanations or our models that aim to explain the process by which the systems minimize free energy also exist in brain. right? So we don't have to take any realist stand or any instrumentalist stand until we start talking about these process theories. And I think that sometimes, it happens a lot that in the literature, these things come conflated, that the free energy principle necessarily entails active inference or necessarily entails or is compatible with process theories like prediction error minimization or predictive coding or predictive process. And these are actually not, there's no entailment between them, as we saw and as we tried to point out in the paper.
If I could ask a quick follow-up on that, actually. So let's say we're in the FEP world, then there's all these corollary process theories that are falsifiable. We've talked about that last week and in several other weeks. What is it, though, that leads someone to accept or reject or be attracted or repulsed by the FEP? So within the FEP, we know how to get from here to there, and you're right, there's no strict entailment. It's actually a totally scientific, empirical question. But how do we get to that FEP understanding that leads us to the downstream process theories?
Okay. I think that there are different goals, and then at least for me, it's useful for me to think about it like that. So what we gain, we're talking about FEP, is that it gives us a much more sort of like grasp, or gets us closer to what things really are, biologically speaking. So what we get is these bounds between like life and death by the form of entropy. So it is this key concept, which is entropy, that you do not get in process theories, because precisely process theories are in a different game. They are in the game of explaining the processes by which cognition is an activity is conducted. So it's the processes, and the FEP is on a different business, which is the business of looking into states. That's why it comes much more related to dynamical systems theory. So that's a point that we tried to make clear in the paper, that it seems to us that comes very often conflated in the literature, that there is an entailment. I mean, active inference is a corollary of the free energy principle. So it is very important precisely to tell us how it is that systems could be minimizing free energy. But there is no necessarily entailment, even though if we want to tell a much more detailed story, then active inference becomes very useful.
Thank you. Scott, Thomas, anyone else who raises their hand?
Thomas, I think you had your hand up first. Is there something you want to jump in on? No? You okay?
You're muted, Thomas.
Yeah, my fault. Unless you have something that's not really related to the current conversation, you can go first, because
if it's related, Thomas, go for it. Otherwise,
go for it. Yeah, go for it.
I noted some comments to a lot of the things people said. So regarding the question of what we get from accepting the free energy principle, I'm honestly not very sure. I'm still trying to figure that out, and I'm hoping we can get some very neat statistical models of behavioral dynamics, and that we can somehow get a better grip on the patterns that we see. And then coming back to what Marco said, if I understood the story correctly, by saying that, why not all of the options simultaneously, right? So in some ways, the model is a very neat description. In another way, the brain's model captures something, is based on something real in the world. I think what happens there, and this is something that I've seen in the literature as well. I don't remember who wrote about that, but I've seen some people saying, oh, well, it's the best of both worlds because we get both representationalism and enactivism. And I think the issue with that is that it assumes that realism is a valid position. It assumes that we can talk about such a thing as a model in the brain in a non-metaphorical sense. It assumes that there is a model in the brain which does or does not latch onto something real. And I think in that sense, the way that you often see people talking in activism and the free energy principle together is by assuming realism and ignoring the inactive criticisms of what realism entails. And there was a second point about whether we need to see representations as involving correctness conditions. I think that's a very fair point, but my response to that would be that it sort of comes back to our talk about encoding, decoding, and language and being clear in general. We, for the sake of our paper, decided what we call representations involve correctness conditions. So if you have a different notion of representation that does not involve correctness conditions, that's a totally different story, and maybe those types of representations could be totally fine. If all you mean with representation is a covariation relation between two different systems, I'm not going to dispute whether that exists or not. That seems fine. But the problem is that if you are that liberal with what representations mean, everyone's going to use them in different ways, and you're going to get that we all use them, but nobody really wants to talk about what they really mean. And that's pretty famously, at least among philosophers, described by Bill Ramsey in a 2007 book, Representations Reconsidered, I think it's called. So the reason to say representations have correctness conditions is mostly just to get clear on the terminology, right? So it's just a signal of this is what we mean when we say representation, and if your notion of representation does not have correctness conditions, that's something else to talk about, and that's another discussion whether those are valid or not then.
Thanks, Thomas. And in an earlier discussion with Maxwell, Ramstead, and others, we had a conversation about how part of representations is that like they have to be able to be wrong, or they have to be able to be off base, otherwise they can't be on base. So yes, lots of other interesting work. Scott, if you would like, and then Stephen, Marco.
Just had something going back to the earlier conversation. It was when we were talking about the ism schism and the ability to, I'm staying with that, and the ability to see inside another system and discern what was going on in that system. It reminded me of the holographic principle, and I started reading another paper last night on why holography. And it was just kind of an interesting notion that the Markov blankets and the holographic principle bear a similarity in there's an opacity to them. And so the internal states and the perception of those internal states from outside may be based on different isms. And that's something that may not ever be bridgeable, I guess, and it may not matter.
We're going to talk to Chris Fields about holographs in March 2021.
Great.
So coming up very soon. Thanks for this great point, Scott. Stephen and Marco.
Yeah, just to build on the this idea that you go from free energy principle and then we go to this process theory. So it's almost like at some point you've got to put dimensions on what's going on. Like there's an inside, there's an outside. So with active inference, there's the idea that the stuff's going to go via the Markov blanket, and there's a way to know. And that way of knowing, it's still to some extent dimensionless, because there's no direct way to transmit the dimensional information. It's only through this entropy. And I know entropy is mentioned in the paper, so I'm kind of interested in this idea of when you go from, say, the entropy in this kind of general sort of non-dimensional sense. It's just a way of knowing. And then you've got this kind of you talk about this idea of a low entropy states or a high entropy states, but you've got this kind of, there's a sort of the jump between the two in a way, where there's like because with active inference, it's the change in entropy which gives the way through the back door to encode knowledge. So because it's through the change in entropy in relation to action, in relation to sensorial data, that you sort of somehow build up a dimensional understanding, even if that understanding is only in the mind, maybe not at the organism level. So I suppose I think that maybe what, I know there's a new paper you brought out on skillful performance that's just come out. So maybe this is sort of opening up these other questions around entropy and dimensionality, and when you actually go from modeling changes to how do these changes relate to information or knowledge flowing or being generated, you know, from the blanket through to the generative model and the world.
Yep, Stephen, thanks. A great point. You're getting at this question, which is how does the dimensionally compressed information from the world, like a panorama that just presents itself, get enriched through our experience and internal model into something that has what you're talking about as dimensionality? And then it's a good question to ask how it relates to the thermostatistical lineage with entropy and some of these very pervasive top-level concepts. So really well brought out. Marco?
Thanks. I was just wondering about Thomas's comments on my comments. If you could elaborate on, first of all, the criticism from enactivism, as he mentioned, but I would love to hear more about that, especially in relation to Maxwell Ramsett and others' paper on enactive inference, or tail of two densities. Also about the correctness condition, I understand that you have to choose a definition of representation, and again, I do understand that you have to respect the lineage in philosophy and what has been established as authoritative or conventional. But I do believe that there is a certain need, I think, to also revamp philosophy, because I feel like there's always this kind of weird dynamic of like the two clubs in the school playground between philosophy and science. One is constantly trying to radically revolutionize the other, but philosophy seems to be so stubborn in not allowing science to revolutionize them, right? They keep trying to, the philosophers keep trying to, you know, to yank the rigid priors out of their shell, but vice versa, somehow there seems to be no path. We're not allowed to do that. So for example, why not let this field of science/philosophy yank that prior of representation having to have correctness conditions out of that shell? Because, for example, you can also just kind of play with it, right? Not a correctness condition, but saying that in the limit it should settle into correctness relation with the target, as if it's kind of fixed point or attractive point, right? You can also say it's not a condition, it's not a limit, but it's a factor that contributes to that thing that we call representation, right? So I think I would love to hear a discussion about that, opening up the whole role rather than this essentialist property, the role of a notion of correctness in relation to representations as situated in the world. And in turn, I also want to again emphasize, so even though that you're right in the difference between the corollaries, the many corollaries, potential corollaries of FEP versus FP itself, where FEP constrains a particular way we create process theories. There's another thing that I think is not often enough talked about, which is the kind of implied picture of sentient systems, for example, from FEP and its corollaries, where we not often enough talk about the interrelational system. It's the way that these systems, insentient agents or complex systems, relate to each other. So it's more specifically for humans or us, we also self-model, And when we're self-modeling, we need to model all the different structures we possess and know what role they play in the big ecosystem that we are. And so in the same way, we can say that in our self-modeling, we also intuit or sense that some of those subsystems have a very instrumental role, right? If, for example, you could say that the executive or attentional mechanisms of the prefrontal cortex is effectively instrumental and in a way realist about itself. But the fact that it has to organize, regulate itself such that let's say, primary physical observables needs to remain in certain bounds, that seems to me instrumental, because it doesn't matter if that really is some quantity or some notion of stability, of feeling good or feeling safe. That doesn't matter, right? It's just settled in that way. But at the same time, if it does latch onto something real, cool. And maybe you can elaborate upon it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all good. You bring up you bring up. Okay, so point 1 was related to inactive critiques. Point 2 was about correctness conditions moving beyond them. Point 3 is sentient systems. So if we want a question that's answered, let's just try to trace out the threads so that we can actually return to it, because they're great points. Okay. Yeah, it's great points, Marco. Is that good, or is there more?
It's just what's the nuance. The third point is more about, in the process of self-modeling, we include the notion or implicitly into it model the notion of, do these things have an instrumental role or more of an epistemic realism, right? That these theories are more about modeling processes of modeling rather than modeling essences and properties.
Yes, the relational all the way down type thinking. So thanks, Marco. Really 3 sides of a very nuanced discussion and an ongoing questions. So Thomas, then anyone else who wants to raise their hand.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm not sure I completely follow everything. So if I get it wrong, just interrupt me and let me know. So I think you mentioned regulation, like bodily regulation, as a form of self-modeling, right? So I think that accepting that bodily regulation is a form of self-modeling is assuming the realist position. There is a clear fact that we see biological organisms self-regulate. Whether they do that by exploiting an internal model is another question entirely. And that's exactly sort of the distinction between instrumentalism and realism that the paper tries to tease apart.
So it's almost that when you mentioned the modeling, the process of modeling is the instrumentalist side on Marco's way of phrasing the third part, and then the question about essences is the realist question. So the movement towards instrumentalism is related to this relational insight?
So I think the issue is I didn't exactly get the relational insight. That's the part that was a little fuzzy for me, and I wasn't sure exactly what he was getting to.
Yeah, Marco, where do you see that relational? Just because it's something that comes up, and it does sort of cross different idea or debates. So what does that mean to you, or how does it play out here?
Yeah. So thanks. So often when you see literature on active inference or Ferenczi principle, there's always a centerpiece of a market language, centerpiece of a certain system / agents, but very rarely is it about
figure one.
What?
I'm showing figure 1, just if you want to refer to this.
Oh yeah, so, exactly. So it's always this, but it's never this with another one that's like this. It's very rarely. I mean, that's the Marco Blankett's Physics of Life or Marco Blankett's of Life paper that does go into it, but very little, and shockingly little in these kind of philosophical papers. Is there actually talk about how Marco Blankets interact with each other and the reflexive or the mutual inference? Because in that process of mutual inference, how do you actually do that, right? How do you model the other models that you possess or are, right? It's not just in terms of properties as such, it's also about the role they have in the bigger inferential ecosystem. But I guess maybe that requires a leap of faith in active inference first, right? If you already assume that the dynamics are governed by inferential imperatives, then you also have a small step to believing that in modeling each other, they also need to model each other's inferential contributions, where we go again back to the decomposition of 300 principle formulation in terms of the epistemic and pragmatic or the accuracy of complex, right? Maybe one mode of engaging with the world or incorporating one particular set of systems of your total constitution will lead to more of an instrumentalist approach, right? When you're just instrumentally engaging with something, not assuming you have a correct view of something. When you have a new game or some weird object, you don't know what the hell it is, you're not going to engage with it based on a realist assumption. You're going to engage with it based on the idea of, I'm going to figure out how to manipulate it. I'm going to find all the instrumental points of latching onto it, right? And so no matter what, you cannot escape the fuzziness or the vagueness or the fluidity of these so seeming dichotomies, in my opinion. And that's the relational aspect, right? That in terms of modeling and its many facets, you need to understand the relations of the different systems as you self-model, especially if you're extremely complex like humans.
Playfulness.
Does that make sense?
Human as a curious investigator, playful insight, relational thinking, and something that kind of is personal and almost distinct from philosophy and or science is the personal, which is we're really studying this, and we're people who have certain valences towards different modes. So pretty interesting. Thomas, Ines.
Yeah. So I think that's a very interesting question, and whether we approach something from an instrumentalist or realist perspective. But I think still that I might be way off base here, but from what I hear, it sounds like it's all still within the realm of realism. And only when you take us to be modeling at all, can you start talking about whether that modeling is instrumentalist or realist? So the instrumentalist position that we defend in the paper is one in which we only model when we literally do so in the world, when you're using your computergram to start up a model, or when you're drawing a diagram when you're literally making models. In any other sort of activity that you're doing, you're not modeling. You're doing the activity. So in picking up a cup, I am not modeling the cup, and I'm not, in any sense, models are not relevant there. I'm picking up a cup. And then I think the other point you made a little earlier about the interaction of science and philosophy, and that it seems that philosophers are always trying to revolutionize science and science is not allowed to revolutionize philosophy. I think that's a fun point as a philosopher. But I think that with the popularity of predictive processing and active inference in philosophy, you see where science really is revolutionizing philosophy as well. And I think especially in philosophy of cognitive science, there's always going to be a bidirectional interplay. I wouldn't have been sitting here if it were not for the influence that science is having on philosophy, of course. I'm delving into all of this. And then when you're talking specifically about the notion of representations, if scientific endeavors could make it extremely plausible to throw away the correctness conditions for representations, then maybe that is something we need to accept. But the issue is that, I think anyway, just at first glance, is that representations are, it's a word we use also outside of science, right? A picture that I draw as a representation of whatever it is I fancy drawing. And there are certain features of that picture that I drew that are particularly relevant in making that picture a representation of whatever it is I drew. Now, when you want to use that same word in science, you might just say, well, none of that is important, and we're going to drop some of the very important features of the picture and use it very differently in our science jargon. That's fine, but it's a little difficult to deal with when we already have a notion of representation and what representations are in just the regular dealings in the world. But you could technically say, sure, we'll call it something else. But it's something that we'll have to all agree on and then be clear about what that means or not.
Thank you, Thomas. So Ines, and then anyone else? So we have like little, half an hour or so left. So if you have any thoughts, prepare them, get ready. We can flip around to different slides. Ines, then Marco.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I want to just say the great points, Thomas. That's precisely what I'm going to sort of like expand or try to expand a little bit on. There's a lot that I'd like to say, but let me just go back to the self-modeling point as the bodily regulation. So I'm really struggling to understand what this means. And the reason for that is because we need to motivate why would the body have to model itself. So typically, one starts this modeling endeavor when we do not have direct access to things. So we wonder about what could be, causes. So I wonder why I'm really struggling to understand what this self-modeling is, because in terms of bodily regulation, because what is it that the body needs to model really? Because we start modeling, we want to model things when we don't have access to a true posterior, when we do not have the causes, so we need to find the posterior, right? But the self-modeling seems like a little bit counterintuitive, because it's the self that is right there, so the body is right there. So it sounds very counterintuitive to me to think that should need any kind of like internal modeling in the body. So the other point that I wanted to get back to was Marco's point, because Marco seems to be like a little bit like worried about the lack, if I understood it correctly, the lack of having sort of like a program or a framework that would allow us to get like things, an explanation that would be like much more relational all the way down, and how would we like link all of this together. And then that's when we came to this slide, I think. So I just wanted to say like a few words on that. I want to say that the cool thing about Markov blankets, as we know, is that, we can apply them regardless of the scale. We can apply them to any scale, and we can nest them. And I think that this is something that Marco could be like a little bit worried about, and perhaps this is not going to be, the solution for what it was mentioning, but maybe it will get us like sort of in the direction. So the idea is that with Markov blankets, we actually understand the relations between different aspects and levels of neurophysiology as being together related in a multi-scale kind of system. So basically the idea is that you can use a Markov blanket to zoom into the level of description that you want to investigate, but without losing sight that this particular level is already embedded in a multi-scaled level system, right? So then this allows us to zoom in up and down, for example, within the brain. And that's a paper that I have, is going to be out soon. So it allows us to zoom in and to zoom up and down in the brain, but it also allows us to zoom out to the organism and then get out to the organism in the environment. So that's a nice thing that we can do with the Markov blankets, where obviously the internal states and the active states are going to correspond to the level of description that we want to look at. And then obviously we are going to look at the embeddedness of this system within its environment, because its environment is going to be the external states and the sensory states. So that's the cool thing that we can do with Markov blankets, is that it allows us to zoom in and out and up and down in a multi-scale system.
Thanks, Ines. Great points. And I think for this zooming in and out seems very relevant to a lot of our work and a lot of what's in the cutting edge. So maybe we can have like a workshop or a panel or something like that, or we'll see it later. But this is really interesting stuff. So again, maybe, 20, 30 minutes. So if anyone has live chat comments, Marco, then anyone else who, then Stephen, and then anyone else who raises their hand, and then Scott.
Thanks. So I just want to go back to models and multiple levels of skills and stuff. So Thomas said something about you're not modeling something, you're just doing, right? And I agree. Again, like I said, my claim is that it varies over the situation context. So again, that's why I argue that you need to zoom out to take in the relation. So if you take the paper on active inference and curiosity with the games, right? So first you're exploring, you're just doing the game. You're kind of allowing the statistical patterns as are impinged upon you to kind of accumulate, shape, and adjust each other, etc. And indeed, at that point, you're just doing, and you're just at the mercy of the covariational relations, etc. But at a certain point, there's some kind of transition. You have a moment of insight. The model, let's say the picture, more naive Picassoian sense, of the game kind of arises into your awareness as a complete kind of picture. And at that point, you're able to, at least hypothetically, write down the model that you think that the game is governed by, right? And so you said something like, we're only modeling when we're doing the computer thing and claim that this is going to be a representation or a model of the environment. But the thing is, what's the chicken and the egg, right? If you're doing that game, you're at the mercy of the patterns, and then you obtain this internal understanding of how the model looks that allows you to create a computational model. That means that the point where the model is instantiated is actually in the agent itself, right? And so that's why I talk about the relational thing and the self-regulation. When you as a system are able to model yourself, then you have different orders of that model. The moment that it's just intuition, just you're guided by the covariational patterns, just letting that be latched onto your action and policy selection, yeah, it's not really maybe it's not a model then. But the moment that you're at this level above, you're able to say that this is a model of that, and this is the epistemic relation, pragmatic relation, then I think we should be able to say that's proper and model proper, right? And another thing, so something Thomas said about when science allows us to throw away the correctness condition, I think we have that in psychology and in social psychology. A lot of people can develop an understanding or a model or representation of the world that is actually not governed by correctness conditions. I don't want to get political, but you see in certain political areas where people seem to be governed not by truth conditions, but more about pragmatic conditions, right? Which beliefs, if adopted, or which ideologies, if adopted, will I be better off in the world, right? That is not a correctness condition. That is taking instrumentalist or pragmatic primacy for the sake of your fundamental imperative of autopoiesis or self-preservation, etc. And so, and Ines's point about non-direct access. So yeah, we're oneself, but it's multi-level, multi-scale. So there remains inferential distance between the locus of certain areas of yourself and other loci of yourself. So the hypothalamus is crucial in self-regulation in terms of guiding the endocrine system. But obviously, it's distant from the actual systems that it is supposed to be in relation to, right? So there needs to be an acknowledgement of the inferential relations and inferential distances by which the self as a whole learns to regulate itself. Yeah, I just leave it at that.
Great, thank you. So in the last little bit, let's think about tying threads up and phrasing things as what we want to. No, it's great, Marco. You did it. You got, and exploring what we want to do next week. So we're raising questions to think about, and for next week, as we tie up some of these really awesome threads. So Stephen, Scott, Ines, Thomas.
Nice. So, well, I just wanted to sort of add on to this, or sort of maybe this is something that could come back to this idea of representation, I suppose it is ultimately seen as something that's in the brain. And a model is also sometimes, and this is maybe where we get a problem, is we kind of have this folk psychology that models are in the brain as well. So I think if we were to say models are in our niche, so if we say we take this figure 1, the model is something we create in our external states, in our niche, that we work with and have tools and we manipulate out there, and we engage with our active states, sensory states, internal states to work with. It can get rid of, it helps to sort of get around some of these challenges. And I think, because I think that is the nature, and I think this is really useful thinking about correctness and accuracy of a model, is when can that need for directness and accuracy be loosened somewhat, because it might be that you don't have to model, the body doesn't have to model its active states or model its sensory states or model those exactly, but it's somehow using something like them, and there's some sort of bigger model which we can try to use as a tool to understand what that aggregates to. So I think this is actually maybe opening up quite a rich thread.
Thanks, Stephen. Scott, Ines, Thomas, Shannon.
I unraised. Skip me.
Thank you, Scott. Ines, Thomas, Shannon.
Okay, so I think that it's important, the question that Marco was raising. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that and just like sort of gesture to it for the next session. So I think that Marco was mentioning this important self-regulation aspect. And I wonder, and this is like a very embodied kind of thing. It's not, available to our conscious level, so we don't know what's happening. So it's not available to consciousness. And I was trying to dispute that idea that it needs to entail some kind of like modeling aspects, because for us to, for it to entail modeling aspects, it's because there is not a direct access to the body, yada yada. And I think that one follow-up question to that would be to think about what self-modeling would mean on a conscious level. Do we ever do that? Do we need to self-model on a conscious level, right? Because if we do, then perhaps there is like a sort of like a barrier between the self and what I think. So it's kind of weird. So I would really like to discuss that with everyone. And and the other question that I think that would be nice to discuss next week is to actually get down to the nitty gritty, to the detailed technical details that would allow us potentially to think these things, or what Thomas and I had in mind in the paper, which is whether from the fact that we can be trained to use, for example, variational base to attain likelihood of model evidence, which is like what we do, Bayesian inference and modeling, that kind of thing. And also from the fact that we as human beings in our daily life, we can think and engage in sort of like abductive reasoning to wonder and make inferences about what we think is the most likely case of things around us. From the fact that we as scientists can do that, and we as regular people in daily life can do that, does it follow that the nervous system itself or the body itself does that and engage in those kind of like tools? So those would be my
Nice. I'm already capturing them on a slide, so we're definitely gonna get to them. Ines, Thomas, Shannon, Marco. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Thomas, Shannon, Marco.
Yeah, thanks. I have a lot in answer to what Marco was saying, so I'll try to slim that down. As a very quick, probably not to convince you, but just as a description of how I would see things. If you're playing a game and at some point you figured out the patterns of the game and you're able to make a model of it, I would say where the model is instantiated is when you draw the model out. That drawing you made, the description of the patterns is the model. And when you're producing that drawing that you can share with other people, that other people have access to, you are modeling. any other modeling, models are never in the brain, models are never in the head, models are in the world, in our interaction with the world, and only exist because of our social cultural heritage in which we have learned to use models, sort of what Ines was getting to as well. And then when you're talking about some people being led not by correctness conditions, I think that's very fair, and I think none of us are generally led by correctness conditions in most of what we do, except for science when we give it our best shot. We're just doing stuff, but the most important thing there is not whether that means then that we need to change representation for it to mean something not involving correctness conditions, but maybe that means that the notion of representation isn't really applicable here. And instead of changing the words we use, we just use a word that is more appropriate to what people are really latching onto. And I think that'll be just communicatively maybe an easier strategy instead of continuously changing the word to fit our current understanding, just sort of come up with a different word that fits better.
Cool. Some neologisms and also our growing terms list. Shannon, then Mark.
Thanks for all of that discussion. I'm wondering if, in search of terms that would better fit our description, is the term expectation more or less vague than saying representation or a model? And what I'm thinking of is when you're standing, your body has a certain expectation that you'll remain standing. If you're standing in a room, you expect, like, you at a conscious level maybe expect to stay standing, but also, your cerebellum and muscles and your trunk are expecting to be in a certain relation to each other because the ground's not moving. So they're just maintaining, some standard standing posture, maybe a little bit of balance side to side. If you feel like you're standing still on a train and then the train starts moving, when your expectation was to stand up straight, now you have a deviation from that expectation. Your cerebellum, your motor cortex, all of the muscles in your trunk and your legs react or predict that they should have been standing upright, predict that they should have been in a certain relation to each other to stand upright. And they either update that prediction or they act to change the world. So if it's acting to change the world, then all of your muscles will tense up in a different way to keep yourself standing upright. If they're just accepting the prediction that you shouldn't be standing already, you'll fall over. And I just wonder, is it helpful to say that your body has a model of standing? Or like Ines says, your body just is in direct access to itself. So even if there's an expectation of standing upright, there's still, like, maybe it doesn't help to call it a model, but there could be correctness conditions in that case if you called it a model. And like if you're so far out of allostasis, right, then you're in an incorrect correctness condition for standing. And so to respond to that perturbation is to bring it back to that correctness condition. And I don't know. I guess, does expectation help, or is that just even more vague than saying that your body has a model of itself?
Fun. Thanks, Shannon. Marco and Ines.
Yeah, actually, what Shannon says is very nice, because I think, again, that reemphasizes the importance of distinguishing the kind of operational constituents of how models play a role in agents. So what she was describing seems to me like the interaction of how the afferent and efferent expectations and data have to interact. And that, indeed, I agree that doesn't have to be called a model. I would just see that as the element or the operation of inferential interactions, right? And kind of a zeroth order or a proto model maybe. But again, it's on top of that, when you have the kind of order above that, where I think you would have to say that there is a model, because then there's also the modeling of how these inferential constituents relate to the world, that has to be modeled too. For example, sometimes we interact with the world in weird ways and we notice it, and we have to actively reflect about how we were guided by our actions. I mean, I don't know which philosopher it was, but philosophy about self-examination, examining your beliefs and assumption. If that's not modeling, I don't know what it is. Ines raised some very nice points. So the role of consciousness too, about conscious self-regulation. And I personally believe I am one of those people who does attribute a function to consciousness, or at least attribute a functional drive that leads to the emergence of consciousness, where by the sheer fact that it is the kind of the apex of higher and higher levels of modeling. Similarly, how multisensory integration is a consequence of this. In the very same way, it seems stands to reason, especially if you look at works like Graciano's attention schema modeling, that the very drive that led to multisensory integration and consciousness is the need to model that which is below that. I'm sure there's some active interest papers on that too. I forgot in response to what it was, but I also wrote down somewhere that it's relevant to take also Mel's paper in this discussion about models, because I think what's very beautiful there, in contrast to this discussion, is the diversity of nuances regarding what a model can be and what they are useful. Right? Although that would probably stand at odds with a lot of enactivists, but you can draw a lot of parallels between the different roles and values that model can play and have for a scientist, and the various ways that models as embodied could be useful. Right? For example, some are good for conceptual exploration, some are more truth-oriented, some are more to kind of integrate different things, and I think these are all valid ways to look at models. And they survive simply by virtue of what free energy principle entails, is that the success of these models is what leads them to persist, right? And the success in terms of their pragmatic and epistemic contributions to minimizing or reducing variation free energy, right? And so it's like, oh wait, yeah, Alex Johnson has a recent paper, right? Or well, one of them had the recent paper on it's about what must be true if you've gotten there.
Actually,
right?
paper.
So what
Yes.
must be true? Yes, yeah, Axel constant. So given that we have, for now, let's assume models, what must be true given that we have them, right? So the answer would be they got there because apparently they contributed to a reduction of variation free energy, right? Also, atoms, I gotta say, I think it's kind of one of those agree to disagree things, because I feel a bit of an axiomatic commitment to models simply cannot be embodied. Although I would love to continue that discussion.
Well,
and
it's
I also think that adapting a language is key. And again, taking the normative principle of free energy, it's the philosophers who disagree. Most people use it like the way that I've been describing, right? Folk psychology and scientists use representation in less of a seemingly anal / rigorous notion of correctness condition. It is simply a part of a bigger picture of how their value should be assessed. So I think in general it's an example of niche construction. We are embedded in a world of language. We're linguistic bodies. So adapting a language instead of throwing it away seems to me the far more reasonable approach. Especially if you want to avoid confusion. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well, it's always interesting to re-listen to one's live stream, because while we're speaking, we think a certain way. It's a different mode. And Ines, you really have finesse with constructing philosophical arguments on the fly, as many other people embody. And the way that is done performatively, Stephen, I'm sure also resonates, but like the way it's done for the first time performatively is very different than hearing it in a different state of mind. It's like it lines up in the moment, but then a different moment, and then it's like, because it's really interesting points. Like, are we self-modeling when you're improvising? Are you self-modeling, or are you just controlling your larynx? Where is consciousness fitting into all of that? Those are really great questions. Ines, and then any closing thoughts? We could go. Anyone else who wants to speak? Ines, and then feel free to drop off whenever you want.
Okay, I just wanted to address Marcos and then address Shannon's point. Very good points. So there was one thing that Marcos said that struck me very, very interesting, because you were saying about that we need to choose the models that are more suitable. And I think that by saying that, obviously we're taking a realist perspective, as in thinking that there are actually those models in the body or in the brain. So that's sort of like what Thomas and I challenged. So I just want to sort of like give my 2 cents on that particular thought and say that I don't think the success is choosing models, but it's more like the success is in choosing the most desired states that are going to get you what you want, which is like, you know, avoidance of dissipation, entropy, uncertainty, and all of that. So states are preferable, models don't exist. So that's kind of like my take on that. And then I just wanted to also address what Shannon was saying, which was really interesting, because I thought that it seemed to me that Shannon was trying to, you know, build up like, you know, okay, let's just really get down to hands-on and see like, how do we really apply these things that we are discussing here into, like, for example, my lab. And I really like that. One thing that I think that is interesting that happens that I see happening a lot with my conversations is that we don't even see how we are already sort of like completely and fully enculturated in a way that we speak about the body and the brain and cognition in general with so many assumptions that these things exist, because it's just the way that we've been enculturated. So as Shannon was describing, I think that I wonder if maybe its expectation is a better word, right? And then like it struck me because I was thinking about it. Okay, so the body has got this expectation, but from what? From what? So is there like, because for the body to have a certain sort of expectation, I would probably think that maybe the body would need to be like sort of like separated from the brain, so it would have like some kind of like expectation. Or some kind of like inbuilt system where the body becomes like sort of a homunculus and also has its own expectations. So detached, I was like a little bit like not sure what to do with that. So yeah, so that would be like a point on whether the body's got this expectation and how. I think that another way to think that would be to think that the whole organism is evolving towards something, right? There's a sort of like at least like one goal that is shared by all living systems, right? Of course, interactions are very idiosyncratic, really context dependent, but there's like one goal that is like sort of like in general terms shared by all living systems, and is that they don't want to die. So so it is evolving towards sort of like avoiding this dissipation. So whatever the state the body's at, it's gotta be dealing with uncertainty, right? Either so then Shannon was giving the example of like, oh, it's standing. So is it there's an expectation of like a certain expectation regardless to in regard to being standing. I think it's more of like the state that the organism itself is, which is either certain or uncertain. It's stable or is not stable. It's fulfilling sort of like a state that is going to, you know, lead me to the next state. So I think that would be like a sort of better way to describe the behavior that is entailed in these cognitive activities that we do, because I'm not sure how to think like the body itself expecting something, but maybe I'm just I missed something here.
Bill, thanks so much for that. Shannon, Marco, and then anyone else who wants to give a last thought.
Great, thanks for that, Ines. I think where you sort of ended, where you have, like most organisms have an expectation of being in a more stable state than a more unstable state, depending on the context and depending on the environment and everything. But the point you made about enculturation, like how does the body have an expectations? And I guess when I said the body, I kind of was implicitly including the brain. So if when your body's actually upright, your brain and your muscular system have an expectation of being stable in that upright position. And I think enculturation, we could also just talk about like the development of certain structures or expectations or situatedness or something. So the same way like enculturation gives us an expectation for a certain form of language, our body, just by existing in the world and being in standing states in lots of different contexts, develops an expectation of what a stable standing state would be like. But I think where you ended sort of on this like constant evolution sort of away from death or away from perturbation or towards stability. I think that covers it, and that was helpful.
Thank you, Shannon. Marco, and then any other comments?
Thanks. Regarding anticipation in the body, some examples. I'm not sure if this translates. It's normally Dutch, but I don't know if you've heard of it. Ork. Soup is eaten with a spoon, but most people will say fork, especially when you're kids in kindergarten. So that is more of a linguistic example because it relies on the notion of rhyme, which you feel or intuit, and the prediction error is again contingent upon the model or the linguistic models that you have. But also just in general, for example, with predator-prey relations, or I don't know, imagine you're at a bar, someone really drunk comes to you, and there's a really big guy with scary tattoos, and there's no words need to be exchanged. But if he comes really close to you, grabs you tightly in the shoulder, there's going to be expectations, and it's felt in the body. And a lot of these expectations, especially imagine you're a racist, you know, and someone colored comes to you. So then you will feel a physical response of anticipating a certain action or something. But because it's contingent upon certain racist beliefs, which is cultured, there clearly needs to be a certain interrelation between the models or the abstractions that you've gathered through culture and the physically or viscerally felt anticipation of an action. And so I think in a lot of ways, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the physically embodied anticipations clearly are contingent upon abstracta or model or representations of something. Because if not, we wouldn't have these visceral bodies. So I think a lot of my personal qualms in activism is often they look at the manifestations, the tip of the iceberg, the marks, the labels, but not the necessary path that it has to have taken to get to that manifestation. And you said also about we don't need models, we just get to our preferred states. But then you get the problem of how do you get to your preferred states? It's not that easy. I want $1 million and a happy family, but how do I get there? And so it's going to be contingent on a lot of complicated detours. And I simply don't believe that you can escape the notion of a model if you let go of the whole correctness condition. But I don't think you can escape at least a model in the broadest sense, as Mel's paper, I think, nicely alludes to, especially with these examples of getting to preferred states, given the complexity of our worlds and given the uncultured reality of that experience.
Thanks, Marco.
So I would love to talk about that next time. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, on Discord or however, we can continue some text brewing and thinking, and it's awesome because it's just like a snapshot into our learning and thought on all of these very important questions. So, Stephen, Scott, Ines.
Thanks. Well, I suppose one thing Ines mentioned there, and this is quite rich, is maybe how does can expectations always be, to some extent, they can by minimizing uncertainty. It's like a backdoor way to get at it, so it's kind of, but I do think there's something quite interesting about another way of thinking about representations beyond the model and beyond some internal brain state. And that's where, but there's something called mental space psychology, which is quite interesting about how we might be constructing and designing understandings of a space. Now, I'm not going to mention that now, but that just something that comes up is there's other mechanisms for modeling that we work with, which is in between just the body moving and it being in the brain, but is everything tied to this active state, sensory states relationship? So it has to be capitulated at some level using our sensorium and using our actions. So so anything that's represented in the way we think it is somehow being capitulated in this active inference process. It's not being just happened offline, so to speak, without any kind of embodiment. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. And the good news is you only have to mention the keyword once for the AI. So Scott and then Ines.
One thing I was thinking about is, we talk about this as a method of analysis of existing systems, biological systems, etc. And it's also the thing that's I've been doing historically is creating synthetic Markov blankets. And I think I alluded to that before. A contract is essentially a synthetic Markov blanket that creates a being pursuant to the attributes in the contract. And so you're taking two different systems and linking them, harmonically coupling them through a set of expectations that are documented in the contract. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting to me is that idea of realism versus instrumentalism. I think it goes away in the context of synthetic systems, because you're essentially instrumenting a system from whole cloth, saying, hey, we're going to create this entity, and it's going to have these attributes. Like a corporation doesn't exist except through the corporate law and the attributes that are assigned to it by shared meaning, but it's all fiction, but it's a very broadly shared fiction. And so it's interesting, that notion of what we use as descriptors for existing living forms, and those things that we set up to create niches, in a sense, for the new synthetic forms. And that's something that I find intriguing with this model from the paper, is that it's, when it's taken to the synthesis of new forms, it changes, I think it changes that analysis, because it's not a question of discovery, but of creativity in terms of the setting up of the attributes in the Markov blanket. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. If I could rephrase that, it'd be like, the realist is focused on those essences of the world. They're going to try to describe what's already out there. That's like big databases of our current legal systems. But once we're in Instrumentlandia, we're talking about designing apparently arbitrary fictions and then manifesting them and enacting them. And so there, the rate limiting step, once you're taking the instrumentalist turn, is literally the innovation and the narrative buildup and how much collaboration you can achieve pragmatically without getting into the realist, allowing people to have a different take on what is, quote, really happening. So really interesting.
And it may allow for the design of scale-free interventions in that case, right? Because you're not just relying on what happened naturally, but rather you can create some predictive possibilities by the way you design one level to allow for the engagement on a scale-free way. Thanks.
All right, Ines, and then I'll have a last comment.
Okay, so I know that we are already a little bit over time, and I do have another meeting, so I'm just going to try to be like super concise. And I just want to say like one final remark regarding the realism instrumentalism. So I just want to say that imagine that I have a model. I just have built the model to understand or make sense of brain data, for example, that I collected from the scan. I can have two. This is a philosophical attitude. I can have either one or the other. I can go and say, no, my model, but that uses all these tools, all these mathematical and conceptual tools, is actually how the brain is working and generating that data. It's not only on my model, it's actually how it is. Or I can say that, no, this is actually my tools that we as a scientific community have built to make sense of the data that we actually have access to and try to generate the activity that we don't have access to. So we need to infer it, right? So just one comment on that particular distinction. And then another thing that I wanted to get to is that Marco was saying that, oh, I can't see how we don't have models, how do you get from one state to the other, and that kind of thing. I just want to say that in that regard, that we do have models, we do have representations on the agent level. I mean, we think, we use abductive reason, we use logics, we have concepts, we do make representations, we represent things, we can do that on the agent level. So scientists do it, we in our daily lives do that. And that is totally fine. No one is disputing that. The dispute is precisely on whether the underlying mechanisms of what allows for us to do that, such as the body in the environment with the nervous system, actually themselves also have that capacity. So that's the question about models. Models on the agent level, yes. On the underlying mechanisms of what allows us to model, that's a different story that I'm not convinced about. And then about how do we get like from one state to the other? I think that we choose. We think, we use again reason, abductive reason. We have representation. We use all of these intellectual machinery that we can and have because we are enculturated systems and living beings with language, and we choose how we get from one state to the next. And then that can be all mapped out with, dynamical causal models if we want to. So I just wanted to finish with that. Thanks so much.
Thanks everybody for this really fun discussion. I'm glad that we opened so many great threads in point one. I'm going to provide a technical wish. Anyone can drop off if they want. I'm going to provide a technical wish and then a concluding thought. So the one technical one is, it'd be fun to have an automated system for philosophical classification of statements, even if only within the domain-specific FEP. So a statement like, the brain has to maximize the A matrix is a real, the brain is a policy selector or something like that, is a realist take, even if the person has some other perspective, but in that sentence grammatically, versus we use this version of SPM to model this. It's like, it's an instrumentalist sentence. So classifying sentences, and then even just like kind of like a time series, like shading our live stream by the way that people are speaking with an underlying generative model. And then are they speaking from a position of implicitly, like, are people speaking from a position of, pronouns in one way or in some other way? These are things that are like emitted states that could be inferred from linguistic patterns. And then the concluding thought was, Scott David talked about paradox. He's talked about it before. Stephen brought up that humans are like a tool culture. Everybody, not just digital culture. Humans are like a handiwork tool people. And so Thomas said, what do we lose with instrumentalism? And so that's really just to conclude by saying, that's what's on the table is, do we just cut our ties with reality? Do we fight for realism and whatever that is lost along the way there? Or do we cut our ties with reality and go fully instrumentalist? Where does that leave us adrift? If we have a really good ship, where do we steer it? Because now we're going to be in more direct contact with our preferences, with our governance structures, because we're going to be really clear that science isn't like advancing some noble truth agenda per se. It's something a lot more, CNS, thank you. It's something that's more on the utilitarians, the technological, it's an engineering development. If the FEP is within the realm of philosophy and engineering, but not academia, for example, it's not too foreign of a world that could exist, which would be different for an idea than other kinds of ideas. And then it's the heart of the matter. And is the heart of the matter how things are, or is it how things are related to each other? So that's which story we're in at that top level. Is the heart of the matter that instrumentalism sidestepping the question, you're losing everything because the heart of the matter is how things essentially are? Well, instrumentalism is only sidestepping that target of what the heart of things are if you think that's essence. But if you think that the heart of how things are is relational, then maybe you can be a realist about instrumentalism. And you say, I'm really making this scientific model. It's really the code that I put on the paper. This is really the conversation we're having, and all these sort of things like that. So it was really an awesome discussion. Much appreciated, all of you ActInf labbers. And we hope to see other people participate in the future. If you're listening this far, you probably could come on one of these conversations, hopefully. So thanks for participating, everyone. And the forum is in your calendar event for those who participated live. Everyone else just stay in touch. But see you next time for 15.2.